The stillness was a kingdom unto itself. It had its own laws, its own geography. Its borders were the cold stone walls of the citadel, its climate the perpetual chill that clung to the air where no sun had ever reached. Its king was Lucian, and he had reigned over this silent, gray dominion for 500 years. Time, for him, was not a river but a vast, stagnant ocean, and he was becalmed upon its surface. He did not sleep, so the nights bled into one another, a single, unbroken expanse of wakefulness he called the dead hours. Tonight marked the beginning of the 6th century since the last time he had truly felt anything resembling peace. A specific night, the night of his turning, that seemed to repeat endlessly in his mind. He sat upon a throne carved from obsidian and sorrow, a relic of an age when his kind did not hide in the shadows, but commanded them. The great hall was empty save for the dust motes frozen in the shafts of moonlight, and his own immutable presence. He did not smell as mortals did. That sense had died with his human lungs. But vampires saw the world in other spectrums: heat patterns, the electromagnetic pulse of a beating heart, the faint, copper-sweet signature of blood moving through veins. He could not smell lavender perfume, but he could detect the chemical heat it generated on skin. Not scent, thermal signature. A cold, clinical substitute for the rich sensory world he'd lost. He did not breathe. His heart, a useless and silent stone in his chest, did not beat. The only sensation was the thirst, a low, constant hum beneath the silence, a cold winter wind that blew through the hollow spaces inside him. He fed, of course, once per month in the clinical ritual of the king's tithe. A condemned criminal or a paid volunteer, his kingdom did not force the gift, would come to his private chambers. He would feed with the emotional engagement of a man taking medicine, drawing just enough to sustain his immortality. It satisfied the physical hunger, but left the deeper thirst, the craving for connection, for intimacy, for meaning, utterly untouched. The heavy doors at the far end of the hall groaned open, a sound that scraped against the profound quiet. Valerius, his captain, and the closest thing he had to a friend in 300 years, entered. The sound of his living footfalls, the soft scuff of leather on stone, was an intrusion, a vulgarity in the sanctified void. Behind him came the humans. Lucian watched them approach, a slow procession of warmth and noise. He saw them not as people but as thermal events, shimmering clouds of heat in his otherwise frigid world. They brought with them the frantic, chaotic rhythm of life, the rustle of fabric, the nervous clearing of throats, the frantic, secret drumming of their hearts. It was a symphony of fragility, and it grated on his ancient weariness. The human king, a portly man whose face was a testament to a life of rich food and easy slumber, bowed low. His words were a torrent of practiced diplomacy, speaking of peace, of ending a century of border skirmishes and mistrust. Lucien listened, his expression as impassive as the gargoyles staring down from the vaulted ceiling. Peace was a practical matter, an equation of power and resources. It had nothing to do with trust or goodwill. It had to do with strength, his strength. The human king offered tribute, gold, silks, spices, all as meaningless as dust to him. Food was ash in his mouth. Drink was flavorless water. Gold could not buy him a single hour of sleep. Then the king stepped aside, revealing the final term of the treaty. His daughter. Her name was Mira. Lucien knew this from the scrolls, but the name was a flat, lifeless thing compared to the reality of her. She was a small, vibrant sun in the desolate landscape of his hall. Where her father was a broad, sputtering candle, she was a focused flame. He watched her step forward, her head held high, the pulse in her throat a tiny, defiant drumbeat against the overwhelming silence. A vein, a delicate thread of blue beneath the pale skin of her neck, was the most vivid thing in the entire room. It was a visual representation of life itself, a river of warmth and vitality that called to the cold desert inside him. The thirst, usually a low hum, sharpened to a piercing note. He felt the phantom memory of fangs lengthening in his mouth, a purely psychosomatic response to such profound proximity to life. She was not sustenance. She was temptation. Her blood would not taste of despair and resignation like the monthly tithe. Hers would taste of fire. He forced the sensation down, crushing it beneath centuries of control. His gaze swept over her. She was dressed in the deep blue of her own kingdom, a color that seemed to absorb the moonlight and hold it captive. Her eyes, wide and dark, met his without flinching. There was fear in them. He could see that. The primal, sensible fear of a warm-blooded creature in the presence of its natural predator. But it was caged behind a formidable wall of resolve. This was not a frightened doe. This was a queen, however small her kingdom. "Princess Mira," Lucien said, his voice emerging from the stillness, a low rumble like stones grinding together deep underground. The words felt foreign, shaped by a tongue and throat that had not tasted wine or bread in half a millennium. "You understand the terms of this alliance." She inclined her head, a slow, deliberate movement. "I do, Your Majesty. I am here to secure peace for my people." Her voice was the anchor. It was the first thing he had heard in an hour that felt real, a sound with texture and warmth that cut through the gray. It was not the sound of a political pawn, but of a strategist who had weighed the costs and chosen her move. He felt a flicker of something that might have been respect, but it was quickly subsumed by the weary practicality of his existence. She was a seal on a treaty. A living, breathing, dangerously warm seal. He rose from his throne, the movement utterly silent, a predator unfolding from its crouch. The humans flinched as one, a collective intake of breath that was a gust of wind in his silent world. He descended the dais, each step measured, closing the distance between them. The closer he got, the more the thermal contrast became a physical force. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin, a tangible presence against the permanent ice of his own. It was like standing near a forge, and he was a creature made of frost. He stopped just before her, close enough to see the fine hairs on her arms, the subtle expansion and contraction of her chest with each breath. He could almost feel the frantic, percussive beat of her heart against his ribs, though he knew it was only a memory of what a heartbeat felt like. For a long, weighted moment, he simply observed her, this impossible creature of change and decay in his world of stasis. Her life was a frantic, fleeting spark, a feverish 80 years perhaps, against his endless, unchanging night. The sheer impertinence of it, the beauty and the tragedy of it, held him captive. A single glance from him carried the weight of 500 years of insomnia. Her return gaze held the fierce, desperate light of a life being lived, right now, in this single, terrifying moment. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her cheek. He could feel the warmth calling to him, a siren song for his cold, dead flesh. The desire to touch, to feel that heat, was a profound ache, a hunger far deeper and more complex than the simple thirst. It was a hunger for what he had lost. But to touch her was to risk breaking her, to leave a frost burn on her skin, to remind them both of the unbridgeable chasm between them. He let his hand fall to his side. "The arrangement is accepted," he declared, his voice flat, betraying none of the chaos her presence had stirred within him. "The princess will be my queen." He turned, not waiting for a reply, and ascended back to his throne, retreating into the safety of his stillness. From his elevated position, he watched her, a small, bright flame in the vast, cold dark of his court. He had secured his peace. He had acquired a political convenience. He did not yet understand that he had just invited the dawn into his eternal night. The wedding was an exercise in chilling pageantry, a ceremony conducted in the dead heart of the night, witnessed by a court of silent, watching predators and a small, terrified contingent of human nobility. Mira stood before Lucian at the base of the obsidian throne, her white gown a stark slash of light against the oppressive gloom. The vows she spoke were in the common tongue, her voice clear and steady, each word a promise of duty, a sacrifice for her people laid at the feet of this marble king. When it was his turn, Lucian spoke in the ancient vampire tongue, the Caliph. The words were guttural and sibilant, a language forged in darkness, steeped in blood. To the humans, it was a terrifying, incomprehensible incantation. To his court, it was a binding oath, ancient and absolute. Mira listened, her expression serene, a perfect mask of bridal deference. She did not understand the sounds, but she felt their weight, their permanence. She was being bound to this creature, this ageless, frozen man, by forces she could not begin to comprehend. Their shared chambers were a vast cavern of black marble and heavy blood-red velvet. A fire roared in a hearth large enough to roast an ox, but its heat seemed to be swallowed by the stone, unable to penetrate the profound, bone-deep cold of the castle. For Lucian, the fire was merely a flickering light, a visual phenomenon devoid of warmth. For Mira, it was a tiny island of life in an ocean of Arctic stillness. He did not join her in the cavernous bed. He stood by the tall, arched window, a silhouette against the moon-drenched, jagged peaks of his domain. He watched her prepare for sleep, a ritual he found both alien and mesmerizing. The unpinning of her hair, the soft brush of cloth against skin, the quiet sigh as she finally lay down. Sleep. It was a gift, a mercy he had been denied for centuries. The very concept was a myth. To him, the approach of dawn was not a promise of renewal, but a terrifying countdown to the arrival of the Great Eraser, the lethal sun that would scour him from existence if he were caught in its light. He spent that first night, and every night that followed, watching her. He would stand in the shadows of their room, a silent guardian or a patient predator, he wasn't sure which. He watched the gentle rise and fall of her chest, a rhythm that was the antithesis of his own stasis. He listened to the soft, even sound of her breathing. In the deep silence of the dead hours, it was the only sound in his world. It became his clock, the only marker of passing time that held any meaning. A single breath, a single heartbeat. Each was a shock of life, a reminder of the vibrant, fragile world that existed just beyond his grasp. He was starved for connection, and she was a feast he could never touch. He maintained his distance, a carefully calculated perimeter. He believed it was for her safety. He did not realize it was for his own. Mira, in turn, learned the rhythms of her new life. She played the part of the dutiful queen with flawless precision. She was gracious to the silent, watchful court. She managed the household accounts of a castle that consumed nothing, and she sat by Lucian's side during his nocturnal audiences, a warm, living symbol of the peace he had forged. But when the castle settled into its deepest quiet, when Lucian took to his silent vigils by the window, her true work began. The royal library was her sanctuary. It was a place of dust and silence, filled with towering shelves of books bound in leather and human skin. And in a forgotten annex, sealed behind an ancient lock, she found what she was looking for. The annex was sealed behind an ancient lock that should have required vampire strength to open. But Mira had noticed the stone around the lock was crumbling. 5 centuries of moisture had weakened it. With an iron poker from the fire and patient leverage over 3 nights, she'd broken through. Inside were the primers, the lexicons, the epic poems and legal codes of the Caliph. She had a mind forged in the crucible of court intrigue, a mind that saw patterns and valued knowledge as the sharpest of weapons. Her father's court had employed a scholar who'd traded with the northern kingdoms. He'd taught her the basics of linguistic patterns, how all languages had roots in older tongues. The Caliph was brutally complex, but her trained mind found the threads. She began to learn. Night after night, by the light of a single shielded candle, she unraveled the complex alien grammar, memorizing the sharp, angular runes, whispering the harsh, sibilant sounds until they felt less foreign on her tongue. The language was a reflection of its speakers, ancient, precise, predatory, and possessed of a deep underlying melancholy. It spoke of eons, of loss, of the terrible weight of immortality. To learn it was to begin to understand the creature she had married. She saw the world through his eyes, a world of gray vision, where colors were muted and life was a fleeting, chaotic anomaly. Her progress was slow but relentless. She learned the words for hunger and eternity, for shadow and sunlight, a word that carried with it a sense of profound, holy terror. She learned the formal, archaic precision of his speech, the subtle ways a single inflection could change a request into a command, a compliment into a threat. She kept her knowledge a perfect secret, a hidden blade she honed in the darkness. It was a shield. It was a key. She did not yet know what door it would unlock. In the early weeks, they tested her. Volkov watched Mira fumble with her dinner knife one evening, struggling with the unfamiliar Valerian table customs. He turned to Cassia with a smirk. "The creature cannot even master a fork," he said in Caliph, his voice dripping with contempt. "And we feared her overhearing our plans? She is barely more sophisticated than the livestock." Cassia laughed, a sound like breaking glass. 5 centuries, and the king brings us this? Our caution was wasted worry. They had tested her with casual insults in Caliph, watching for any flicker of understanding. She had given them nothing. Their vigilance had slowly corroded into contempt. Lucian remained a figure of immense and distant power. Their interactions were formal, brief. He would inquire after her comfort, his voice a low, gravelly monotone. "Is the fire adequate? Do the kitchens provide what you require?" He saw her eating, a process he found both grotesque and fascinating. The way she brought a piece of bread to her lips, the taste of it, the nourishment it provided. It was a magic he had long forgotten. He was a king of a dead kingdom, and she was a constant, painful reminder of life. He treated her with a cold, impeccable courtesy, the way one might treat a priceless, fragile artifact. He was careful not to break her. One evening, nearly 2 years into their marriage, as the moon climbed high and the castle descended into its deepest hush, Mira was returning from the library, a heavy tome clutched to her chest. The treaty had held for 22 months now. 22 months she had spent in obsessive study. She took a less traveled route, through a long, echoing gallery lined with portraits of Lucian's ancestors, a procession of pale, stern-faced immortals whose eyes seemed to follow her. Up ahead, she saw 2 figures standing in a pool of moonlight slanting from a high window, Lucian and his captain Valerius. She froze, melting back into the deep shadows behind a tapestry. She heard their voices, speaking not the common tongue, but the ancient, guttural Caliph. Her heart, that traitorously loud organ, began to hammer against her ribs. This was the first time she would hear the language spoken in casual conversation, not in proclamations or vows. Valerius's voice was a low rasp. "The southern lords are placated. The treaty holds. Your strategy was sound, my king." Then came Lucian's reply, a sound like stone shifting. "It is a temporary peace. Mortals are fickle. Their loyalties shift with the seasons." "But the queen," Valerius pressed, his tone laced with something that might have been curiosity. She conducts herself with unforeseen grace. The court is intrigued by her. Mira held her breath. She leaned forward, straining to hear, every nerve alight. The air grew colder, a sure sign of Lucien's presence. There was a long, deep silence, a void that seemed to pull all sound into it. When Lucien finally spoke, his voice was utterly devoid of warmth, a flat, final pronouncement. "She is a means to that stability," he said, the words precise and sharp as shards of ice. "A political convenience, nothing more." The words, perfectly understood, struck Mira with the force of a physical blow. A political convenience. A means to an end. A thing. Not a person. Not a queen. Not a wife. She felt a crack spiderweb through the careful composure she had built around her heart. It was a cold, clean break. She had known, of course. She was not a fool. She had entered this marriage with open eyes, knowing it was a transaction. But to hear it stated so baldly, so dismissively, in his own tongue, to his most trusted confidant, it hollowed her out. The small, secret part of her that had looked at the lonely king and seen a flicker of shared solitude, that had hoped for a sliver of respect, of connection, that part of her died in the cold moonlight of the gallery. She did not make a sound. She did not cry. The heartbreak was a silent, internal shattering. She clutched the book tighter, its sharp corners digging into her ribs, grounding her. She waited until their footsteps receded, until the gallery was once again empty and silent. Then she turned and walked back to her chambers, her steps measured, her face a serene, unreadable mask. He would never know. He would never know she had understood. And in that moment, her secret knowledge transformed. It was no longer a shield. It was a weapon. She would be the perfect, convenient queen, and she would watch, and she would listen, for everything. The king's words became the bedrock of Mira's new reality. A political convenience. The phrase echoed in the silent moments, a constant, chilling refrain. But heartbreak was a luxury she could not afford. Instead, she transmuted the pain into purpose. Her study of the Caliph intensified, becoming an obsession that consumed the dead hours, while her husband stood his silent watch. She was no longer just learning a language, she was mastering a system of power, decoding the very essence of the world she now inhabited. She moved through the castle not as a queen, but as a spy cloaked in the unassuming guise of a human bride. Her perceived fragility was her greatest asset. The ancient, arrogant vampires of Lucien's court saw her as little more than a decorative, breathing treaty. They spoke freely in her presence, their ancient tongue a veil they believed she could not pierce. She became a connoisseur of whispers. She learned to distinguish the silken, conspiratorial tones of Lord Volkov, a cadaverous vampire with eyes like chips of obsidian, from the deceptively melodic cadence of Lady Kasia, whose beauty was as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. They were two of the most senior members of Lucien's council, fixtures of his court for centuries, their loyalty supposedly as immutable as the stone of the citadel itself. Yet, Mira began to notice the subtle discord beneath their flawless courtier's facade. A shared glance that lasted a fraction too long. A phrase left unfinished when she entered a room. A pattern of agreement between them that felt too practiced, too absolute. Lucien, lost in the vast ocean of his own immortality, saw only the surface. He observed his queen's growing quietness, her increasingly distant presence. He misinterpreted it completely. He saw a young woman succumbing to the oppressive atmosphere of his world, a flower wilting without sun. He saw her pallor and assumed it was fear. He saw her silence and assumed it was the melancholy of a displaced soul. On one occasion, he found her in the library, poring over a star chart, her brow furrowed in concentration. "These halls can be draining for those accustomed to the sun," he had said, his voice a low rumble from the doorway. He did not enter fully, always maintaining that careful, cold distance. If you require distraction, the jewel collection is extensive. Mira had looked up, her expression carefully neutral. Thank you, Your Majesty. I find the celestial patterns soothing. She was, in fact, cross-referencing the chart with a passage from an ancient text describing the ritual significance of the blood moon, a phrase she had overheard Volkov murmur to Kasia. The dramatic irony of their situation was a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. The man whose dismissal had wounded her so deeply was now the unwitting subject of her protection. She was guarding a king who saw her as a piece on a board, and she was doing it by using the very skills he couldn't even conceive she possessed. Her days were a careful performance of wifely duty, her nights a frantic race to piece together a puzzle whose picture she could not yet see. The tension was a constant thrum beneath her skin, a second heartbeat. She learned to control her breathing, to slow the frantic pulse in her throat whenever Volkov's cold gaze lingered on her, as if he might somehow hear her deception. The breakthrough came during a council meeting. Mira sat on her smaller, less ornate throne beside Lucian's, a silent, decorative presence as always. The discussion, conducted entirely in the Caliph, concerned a territorial dispute with a feral clan to the north. It was tedious, circular, and deliberately so. Mira realized it was a performance for Lucian's benefit. The true meeting was happening in the spaces between the words. Volkov was speaking, his voice a dry rustle of old parchment. The feral curs are a nuisance, but they lack the discipline for a true war. A show of force at the border will suffice. A simple, logical statement. But as he spoke, he subtly tapped his finger on the arm of his chair. 2 quick taps, a pause, then one more. A coded signal. Across the room, Lady Kasia, while appearing to study her immaculate nails, mirrored the gesture almost imperceptibly. Mira's blood ran cold. It was a prearranged signal. She had seen it before, in a different context, but now it clicked into place. She forced herself to remain still, a statue of a queen, while her mind raced. She began to listen not just to the words, but to the silences, the inflections, the coded gestures. The entire council session was a sham, a carefully constructed play to distract Lucian while the real discourse happened in a language of secret signs. The conspiracy was deeper and wider than she had imagined. It wasn't just Volkov and Kasia. There were others. That night, she feigned a headache and retired early, dismissing her human handmaidens. She needed to be alone, to think. She paced the vast, cold expanse of her chambers, the velvet curtains muffling the sound of the wind howling outside. The pieces were scattered before her, but the image was beginning to form. A secret alliance within the council. A shared dissatisfaction. But with what? Lucian's rule was absolute, his power unquestioned for centuries. What could they possibly hope to gain? The answer, she suspected, was him. Or rather, his new policies. The peace with the human kingdom. Lucian's apparent softening. To ancient, predatory creatures like Volkov, peace was weakness. Alliance with mortals was a contamination of their bloodline, a dilution of their power. They saw Lucian's marriage to a human as the ultimate betrayal, a sign that their king had grown weary, decadent, and unfit to rule. They wanted a return to the old ways: conquest, fear, and absolute dominion. They wanted a king who remembered he was a predator, not a diplomat. Driven by a cold, clear certainty, she did something reckless. She slipped out of her chambers, cloaked in a dark shawl, and made her way toward the lower levels of the castle, to the ancient crypts where the oldest of the vampire lines slept their dreamless, waking slumber. It was a place forbidden to mortals, a place of profound cold and echoing silence. She had overheard Cassia mention the old sanctum in a hushed whisper, a place where the air was pure and untainted by the mortal stench. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but she had to know. Before descending, she had prepared. In her studies, she had found a reference to Night Veil, a paste made from ash, graveyard soil, and her own blood. When smeared on skin, it masked a mortal's thermal signature for perhaps an hour. It was alchemy born of desperation, a trick human vampire hunters had used centuries ago. She'd applied it before leaving her chambers, her skin clammy with the death-cold paste. To vampire senses, she would register as nothing more than a cold draft, a patch of stone-temperature air. The paste burned where it touched her veins, but she forced herself still. The air grew colder with every descending step, the torchlight flickering against walls slick with damp. The silence here was different, not the empty stillness of Lucien's hall, but a heavy, waiting silence, thick with dormant power. She found the chamber Cassia had spoken of, its entrance marked by a carving of a snarling basilisk. The heavy stone door was slightly ajar. Holding her breath, her heart a wild bird in her chest, Mira peered through the crack. Inside, illuminated by the ghostly light of phosphorescent moss, were Volkov and Cassia. They were not alone. 3 other council members were with them. They stood around a stone sarcophagus, upon which lay a long, coiled chain. It shimmered with a sickly, pale light, utterly alien to the gloom of the crypt. "The Forge Master confirms it is ready," Volkov said, his voice a low hiss that echoed in the stone chamber. He ran a gloved finger along the chain's length. Forged from the heart of a fallen star, pure silver, laced with the venom of the abyssal worm. Not even the king's blood can withstand it. Lady Cassia smiled, a slash of crimson in her pale face. And the timing is perfect. The marriage was the final sign of his decay. For 4 centuries we watched and waited, hoping his melancholy would pass. But this? A human queen? He has forsaken what we are. During the blood moon rite, Volkov continued, his connection to the shadows is at its weakest. He will be vulnerable for the first time in centuries. He will be mortal. He kneels for the ritual offering, another lord added. That is when we strike. We snare him in the chain, his power will be severed, the throne will be empty. And the peace treaty gives us the perfect cover, Kasia added with cruel satisfaction. No one suspects conspiracy when the kingdom celebrates alliance. Her presence proves his weakness. He would never have accepted such terms in his prime. Mira pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. This was it. The full, horrific scope of their treason. They were not just planning a coup. They were planning to murder their king. Her husband, the man who considered her a mere convenience. A cold, pragmatic part of her brain whispered that she should let it happen. She could escape in the chaos, return to her own world. She would be free. But she looked at the cruel, hungry ambition on their faces, and she thought of Lucien, standing alone by the window night after night, a solitary figure trapped in an eternity of loneliness. He was cold, yes. He was arrogant, he had hurt her, but he was not evil like this. His was a tragedy of stasis, theirs a sin of rapacious greed. In that moment, her choice was made. She was not just Princess Mira of Eldoria. She was Queen of the Valerians, whether he valued her or not. And no one was going to destroy her kingdom. She backed away from the door, silent as a shadow, her mind already racing, formulating a plan. The blood moon was in 2 nights. The night of the blood moon arrived like a held breath, a celestial omen. The moon hung in the sky, swollen and red, bathing the jagged peaks of the citadel in an eerie crimson light. The very air in the castle felt thin and charged, vibrating with ancient power and impending ritual. Within the grand ossuary, the ceremonial heart of the citadel, the air was thick with the scent of cold stone and something older, something metallic and sacred. Lucian stood before the altar of ages, a massive slab of basalt veined with what looked like solidified shadow. He was dressed in ritual robes of black and silver, his face paler than usual, his posture rigid with the effort of the rite. As the lore dictated, on this one night every century, the king had to sever his deepest ties to the ambient magic of the realm to renew his personal power, a process that left him temporarily weakened, his immortal resilience frighteningly diminished. He would be, for a few precious minutes, almost killable. His council members formed a circle around him, their faces solemn masks of devotion. Volkov and Kasia stood closest, their positions of honor a bitter mockery of their true intent. Ancient law held that council members could bring offerings to the blood moon rite, tokens of fealty to be placed at the altar. Volkov had declared his offering, an ancestral chain of binding, symbolizing eternal loyalty. The guards, bound by tradition, had not questioned it. No weapon had ever been raised in the ossuary in 500 years. Why would this night be different? Mira watched from her seat on a raised dais to the side, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. She could feel the predatory stillness of the conspirators, a palpable tension coiling in the room. Under the heavy velvet of her gown, strapped to her thigh, was the only weapon she could devise, a small, intricately carved silver locket, a relic of her human homeland. It contained a crystallized shard of sunstone, a sacred artifact said to hold a fragment of concentrated daylight. To a vampire, it would be agony. Not lethal in such a small dose, but blindingly painful, a shock to their dark-adapted senses. It was a desperate, flimsy defense against beings of their power, but it was all she had. But she had another plan, a more dangerous one. In her studies of the altar's construction, she had learned it was not just a block of stone, but a magical conduit designed to channel the raw power of the blood moon into the king. The ancient texts had also spoken of fail-safes, of containment runes carved into its base, designed to overload the conduit in case of a ritual mishap. The text had been disguised as an architectural treatise on the construction of sacred spaces. The fail-safe sequence was buried in Chapter 47, described in dry, technical language about emergency pressure release valves for magical conduits. To anyone not specifically looking for a weapon, it read like tedious engineering documentation. But Mira had cross-referenced 5 other texts about blood moon rituals, ancient basalt properties, and shadow magic before she could determine which sequence would create an overload rather than a controlled shutdown. The runes were complex, a specific sequence that had to be activated in the correct order, a sequence she had memorized 3 nights ago. Lucian knelt before the altar, his head bowed. This was the moment of ultimate vulnerability he had unknowingly shared with his enemies for centuries. Mira saw Volkov's hand move subtly beneath his cloak. She saw Kasia's eyes narrow, a predator sighting its prey. The silver chain, she knew, was ready. They would move in seconds. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the suffocating silence. She could not fight them. She could not scream for help without revealing her knowledge and likely being killed instantly. She had to outthink them. It was a suicidal risk. Overloading the altar could unleash a wave of chaotic energy, potentially harming everyone in the room, including Lucian and herself. But it was the only chance she had. As Volkov and Kasia took their first synchronized step forward, their hands reaching for the hidden chain, Mira moved. She did not run. She did not scream. She stood up, her movements fluid and regal, and descended from the dais. She walked toward the center of the circle, her expression one of serene, wifely concern. The conspirators froze, their plan momentarily disrupted by her unexpected action. Lucien, deep in his ritual trance, did not stir. "My king," Mira said, her voice in the common tongue ringing out with perfect clarity in the silent chamber. "Forgive my interruption. a gift to mark this sacred occasion. Volkov's eyes flashed with fury at the delay, but he could do nothing without revealing himself. Mira walked past him, her skirts brushing against his robes, and approached the altar. She knelt beside her husband, positioning herself as if to present a gift, her body shielding her actions from the council's view. Her back was to them, her full attention seemingly on the kneeling king. With trembling fingers, she reached down to the base of the altar, her touch tracing the ancient, cold stone. She found the first rune, then the second. Her mind raced, reciting the sequence from the ancient text. Anar, Keth, Vol, Umbra. Fire, blood, power, shadow. She pressed the runes in order. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a low hum began to emanate from the altar, a deep, resonant vibration that shook the very bones of the ossuary. The basalt began to glow from within, first a faint red, then a blinding, furious white. A wave of pure, untamed energy erupted from the conduit. It was not a physical explosion, but a psychic one. A silent scream of raw power that slammed into every vampire in the room. They staggered back, crying out in the ancient tongue, their hands flying to their heads. Their dark-adapted senses were overwhelmed. The carefully constructed ritual was shattered, the sacred space violated by a torrent of chaotic magic. In the ensuing chaos, Volkov, blinded and disoriented, dropped the silver chain. It clattered to the stone floor with a discordant, ringing sound, its pale, sickly light a beacon of his treason. Lucien was thrown from his trance, the psychic backlash hitting him like a physical blow. He grunted, falling back from the altar, his eyes wide with shock and confusion. He saw the overloaded altar, the writhing council members, and the silver chain lying at Volkov's feet. And he saw Mira, kneeling beside him, her face pale but her eyes blazing with fierce intelligence. The loyal guards, including Valerius, who had been stationed at the perimeter, drew their swords, sensing the betrayal even if they didn't understand its source. Valerius and his men surged forward as the magical chaos erupted, but it was the fallen chain, glowing with its unnatural silver light, that told them everything. It lay at Volkov's feet, still clutched in Kash's trembling hand. Star-forged silver, Valerius snarled, recognizing the distinctive pale luminescence. Weapon forged, treason. His men surrounded those nearest the chain. The coup was over before it had truly begun. Volkov, Kasha, and their allies, still reeling from the magical onslaught, were quickly subdued, their faces a mixture of agony and disbelief. They stared at Mira, their expressions of contempt now twisted into horrified confusion. The little human queen, the decorative convenience, had undone them. How? As the guards dragged the traitors away, a profound silence fell over the ossuary, broken only by the fading hum of the overloaded altar. Lucian pushed himself to his feet, his strength slowly returning. He stared at the scene, his mind struggling to process the impossible chain of events. He turned to Mira, who remained kneeling on the cold floor, her composure absolute. Awe, confusion, and a dawning, terrifying respect warred within him. "You saved my life," he said, his voice raspy. He spoke in the common tongue, the language he assumed was the only one she knew. He reached down, offering her his hand. "You were brave beyond measure. I do not understand what you did, but you have my gratitude." Mira looked up at him, her dark eyes unreadable. She ignored his outstretched hand and rose to her feet with a grace that was entirely her own. She met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw not a pawn, not a treaty, but an equal. Then she spoke, and the world tilted on its axis. She did not use the common tongue. Her reply came in flawless, archaic Caliph, her accent as pure as if she had been born to it, her cadence carrying the weight of ancient sorrows he thought only his kind could comprehend. "Bravery is a necessity," she said, her voice quiet, but cutting through the vast hall like a shard of obsidian. when one's husband declares her a mere convenience. Every word was a perfectly aimed blow. She had weaponized his own language, his own dismissive cruelty, and turned it back on him. The shock was so profound, so absolute, that for a moment Lucian's mind went utterly blank. The centuries of iron control, of emotional stasis, of weary detachment, it all shattered. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. The quiet nights spent in the library, her soothing interest in celestial charts, her uncanny ability to be in the right place at the right time, it all coalesced into a truth so blindingly obvious, so deeply shaming, that he felt the phantom sensation of a heart cracking in his chest. She knew. She had known all along. She had stood by his side, a silent partner in a kingdom that saw her as a pet, and she had understood every slight, every condescending word, every secret whispered in her presence. She had heard his callous dismissal of her to Valerius, and she had buried that wound so deep he had never seen a flicker of it. And then, with that knowledge, with that pain, she had saved him. She had saved his throne, his life, his kingdom, all while knowing he considered her nothing more than a tool. The sheer magnitude of her strength, her intelligence, her honor, left him breathless, a sensation he hadn't experienced since he'd last drawn air as a mortal man. The gray, stagnant world he inhabited was suddenly thrown into sharp, painful focus, and at its center was this brilliant, burning, mortally wounded woman. He had possessed a treasure beyond reckoning and had been utterly, unforgivably blind to it. The aftermath of the failed coup was swift and absolute. There was no trial. In Lucien's kingdom, treason was not a crime to be debated, but a disease to be excised. The following evening, he convened the entire court in the great throne hall. The atmosphere was thick with tension and fear. The failed conspirators, including Volkov and Kasia, were brought forth in silver chains that sizzled against their skin. Their immortal arrogance burned away to reveal a core of primal terror. They knelt before the obsidian throne, stripped of their titles and finery. Lucien sat upon his throne, a figure of terrible, ancient authority. But tonight there was a second throne beside his, one that had often remained empty or served a purely ceremonial purpose. Tonight, Mira sat upon it. She was dressed in a gown the color of midnight, adorned with silver that mirrored the chains on the traitors. Her face was a pale, beautiful, and utterly unreadable mask. She was no longer a decorative consort. She was a monarch presiding over a judgment. Lucien rose, his silence commanding more attention than any shout. He looked out over the sea of pale, watchful faces, his gaze sweeping over every vampire in his court. When he spoke, it was in the Caliph, his voice resonating with centuries of power. "You see before you Lord Volkov, Lady Kasia, and their co-conspirators," he began, his tone as cold and sharp as a winter wind. "They stand accused of treason against the crown, a crime for which the only punishment is erasure." A collective, sibilant hiss of agreement went through the court. "They sought to usurp my throne. They sought my final death." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. He turned his gaze to the kneeling traitors, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "But their crime is deeper than simple ambition. Their greatest treason was not against me, it was against their queen." A stunned silence fell over the hall. Heads turned toward Mira, whose expression did not flicker. Lucien began to pace before the throne, his movements slow, deliberate, predatory. "These fools," he said, gesturing with contempt at the prisoners, "saw a human. They saw a weakness. A mortal bride brought here to seal a peace they deemed beneath us. They saw a convenience." He stopped and turned back to the court, his voice dropping to a raw, intense whisper that carried to every corner of the vast room. "They were blind. blinded by the same arrogance that has festered in the heart of our kind for millennia. The arrogance to believe that what is fleeting is worthless, that what is warm is weak. He walked until he stood directly before Mira's throne, and then he did something no one in that hall had ever seen their immortal king do. He turned his back on the court, on the traitors, on his entire world, and focused solely on her. "It was not my power that saved the throne," he declared, his voice resonating with a truth that was both a confession and a proclamation. "It was not the loyalty of my guards, it was the mind of my queen, a mind sharper than any Valyrian blade. She, a stranger in our land, saw the rot in my own counsel. She, who has never known a century of life, unraveled a plot centuries in the making. She, whom we, so gravely underestimated, was the only one who saw the truth." He took another step closer, and the court watched, breathless, as their ageless monarch exposed a vulnerability they had never imagined he possessed. He looked at Mira, and his voice, for the first time, lost its edge of command and was filled with a profound, aching regret. "I, too, was guilty of this blindness," he said, the admission costing him more than any physical blow ever could. "I saw a political necessity and failed to see the woman. I saw a treaty and failed to see the queen. For this, my failure, my unforgivable error in judgment, I am eternally shamed." And then, before his entire court, before the traitors who had sought to overthrow him, King Lucien, master of the eternal night, knelt. He went down on one knee before Mira's throne, bowing his head in an act of utter, unconditional surrender. It was an act of fealty no Valyrian king had ever made, to anyone. It was a public dismantling of his own pride, a groveling born of horrified realization. "Queen Mira," he said, his voice now quiet, meant for her alone, yet audible to all in the pin-drop silence. "I beg your forgiveness. Not as your king, but as the man who was not worthy of you." The hall was frozen. The vampires stared, their immortal composure shattered by the sight. They were witnessing the birth of a new legend, the reordering of their entire world. The human queen was not a convenience. She was the power behind the throne, the king's acknowledged superior in wisdom and courage. Mira looked down at the bowed head of the most powerful creature she had ever known. She saw the public atonement, the strategic necessity of it. He was cementing her power, making it unassailable. But she also saw the genuine, agonizing shame in the rigid set of his shoulders. The public display was for the court. The apology was for her. It was a start. A monumental, world-shaking start. But the wound in her heart, the one carved by his cold words in a moonlit gallery, was not so easily healed. She rose from her throne, a slim, regal figure in the oppressive hall. She looked from her kneeling husband to the condemned traitors. When she spoke, her voice was calm, clear, and carried the effortless authority of a true ruler. She spoke in the Caliph. "The king has passed his judgment on your treason against the crown," she said to the conspirators. "I shall pass judgment on your treason against the peace I was brought here to secure. You sought to plunge 2 kingdoms back into darkness and bloodshed for the sake of your own bitter pride. For that, there is no forgiveness." She looked at Lucien, still kneeling before her. "Let them be erased." Then, her voice softening almost imperceptibly, she added for him alone, "Rise, my husband. We have a kingdom to rule." She did not say she forgave him. She did not have to. In that moment, she had claimed her power, her place, and had offered him not absolution, but a chance. A chance to earn what he had so carelessly discarded. The public atonement secured Mira's position, but it did not mend the fractured trust between them. Not all accepted it. In the weeks that followed, 3 minor lords quietly withdrew from court, retreating to remote estates rather than serve under a mortal queen. Lucian let them go. "Let the weak exile themselves," he declared. "Those who remain understand that power takes many forms." But Mira also won unexpected allies. The younger vampires, those turned in the last century, saw her differently. She represented change, evolution, the possibility that their eternal existence need not be eternal stagnation. In the silent, private hours of the night, the vast space of their chambers felt more like a chasm than ever before. Lucian had laid his pride at her feet in front of his entire world, yet he understood that this grand gesture was merely the opening move in a campaign he had to win. He had to earn her heart, a concept he was only just beginning to comprehend after centuries of believing such things were relics of his long-dead mortal life. He began not with gifts of power or wealth, things he now knew she neither needed nor valued, but with offerings of what he had lost. He started to bridge the sensory void that separated them. One night, he entered their chambers carrying a single, perfect peach, its skin a downy blush of sunset. He knew she missed the fruits of her homeland. He set it on a small silver plate beside her reading chair. He could not detect its fragrance through scent, could not imagine its taste, but he watched, from his customary distance by the window, as she picked it up. He saw the way her eyes closed as she inhaled its scent, a ghost of a memory for him. He watched her bite into it, and for the first time, he didn't see the act of eating as a strange, messy, mortal habit. He saw it as an experience, a moment of pleasure, a connection to a world of flavor and life he was forever barred from. He was not just observing, he was trying to understand. He started speaking to her. Not about treaties or court politics, but about her. He would ask about the books she read, his formal, archaic speech softening as he struggled to find the right words. "That tome. Its script is human. What tale does it tell?" He listened, truly listened, as she spoke of human poets who wrote of love and loss, of heroes who lived and died in the span of a few dozen pages. To him, who had lived 1,000 epics, the brevity of it was heartbreakingly beautiful. His greatest challenge was overcoming the stasis versus pulse that defined their existences. He was a creature of absolute stillness, she of constant, vibrant life. He began to try and share his stasis with her in a way that was not oppressive. He would tell her of the past, not as a history lesson, but as a personal memory. He brought her to the highest tower of the citadel, to a chamber he had not entered in 200 years. It was an observatory, filled with brass astrolabes and celestial charts etched onto plates of obsidian. "When I was a boy," he said, his voice a low murmur in the dark, "a mortal boy, I dreamed of charting the stars." It was the first time he had ever spoken of his human life to her. He pointed a pale, long-fingered hand toward a faint constellation. "My father taught me their names. The huntsman, the serpent. He said they were eternal." He gave a short, mirthless laugh. He was wrong, of course. Even stars die. I have seen it. I have watched entire constellations burn out and fade from the sky. It is a lonely thing to outlive the stars themselves. In that moment, Mira saw him not as a king or a vampire, but as a profoundly lonely soul, adrift in an ocean of time too vast for any one being to bear. She felt a flicker of something more than respect, something warmer. It was the beginning of empathy. She saw the ache of the unreachable in his eyes, as he looked at a night sky that was, for him, a graveyard of memories. He began to show his vulnerability in other ways. The thirst was a constant presence, a cold coil of hunger in his gut. He had always shielded her from it, treating it as a shameful, predatory secret. But one night, as they sat in shared silence in the library, he allowed the mask to slip. His control wavered for a moment, a scent from the kitchens, perhaps, or the simple, overwhelming fact of her living presence. His posture stiffened, his knuckles white where he gripped the arm of his chair. An almost imperceptible tremor ran through him. Mira saw it immediately. She saw the tension in his jaw, the faint predatory gleam that entered his eyes. The pulse in her own throat quickened with instinctual fear. But instead of retreating, she held her ground. She looked at him, her gaze steady. "Lucien," she said, her use of his name without his title a quiet intimacy. He flinched, his composure returning as he wrestled the thirst back into its cage. "Forgive me," he rasped in the Caliph. "It is a constant companion." "You do not have to hide it from me," she replied in the same tongue, her voice soft. "I am your wife, your queen. I am not a child to be frightened by the dark." She made a decision then, a gesture of trust that would cost her everything or gain her everything. Slowly, deliberately, she tilted her head, exposing the delicate, vulnerable line of her throat. The vein in the throat, that visual motif of life that had so captivated him on their first meeting, was now offered to him. It was not a submission, it was a challenge, an act of supreme trust. "I see the monster within you," the gesture said, "and I am not afraid." Lucien stared, frozen. The sight was a symphony of temptation, a siren call to every dark instinct he possessed. The thirst screamed within him, a raging gale, but beneath it, something else rose. A wave of overwhelming protective tenderness. She was offering him the ultimate intimacy, the crimson gift, not as a victim, but as a partner. She was trusting him with her very life, trusting that the man she was beginning to see was stronger than the monster. He did not move. He could not. The battle within him was titanic. To accept would be to sate a hunger that had gnawed at him for centuries. But it would also be to take, to dominate, when all he wanted now was to give, to share. He slowly shook his head, his eyes filled with an agony of self-denial that was more profound than any hunger. "I will not take from you, Mira," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion he could barely contain. "Not like this, not ever. If it is ever to be, it will be a gift freely given, an exchange, not a feeding." He rose and left the library, the need for control so absolute that he had to physically remove himself from her presence. Mira watched him go, her hand rising to her throat. Her heart was beating steadily now. The fear was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant certainty. He had been tested. The predator had been faced with the ultimate temptation and had chosen the man. He was not just atoning for his words, he was remaking himself, fighting a battle against his own nature for her sake. He was earning her. And, she realized with a slow, dawning wonder, he was winning. The change was gradual, a slow thaw after a long winter. The vast, cold spaces of the castle began to feel less empty. The silence between them was no longer a chasm of distance, but a comfortable quiet, a shared solitude. Lucien continued his vigil, watching her sleep, but now it was different. It was not the detached curiosity of a scientist studying a strange specimen. It was a tender, protective watch. He saw not her fragility, but her strength, the resilience that allowed her to rest, to dream, to recharge. A cycle of renewal he would never know. He began to see her mortality not as a weakness, but as a precious, finite gift that made every moment with her excruciatingly valuable. Mira, in turn, began to see beyond the lonely king. She saw the brilliant strategist who had held a kingdom together for 500 years. She saw the weary soul who carried the weight of countless sorrows. She saw the man who had outlived stars and was now learning to navigate the geography of a single human heart. She started to leave flowers in their chambers, bright, colorful blossoms from the castle's southern greenhouse, a glass structure built into the mountainside where reflected moonlight and magical heat lamps coaxed blooms from stubborn bulbs. They would wilt and die within a day, a poignant reminder of the fleeting beauty of her world, but for that one day, They brought a splash of vibrant life into his gray existence. He never touched them, but he would stand and look at them for hours. The final wall between them crumbled on a night when a fierce, unseasonable storm raged outside the citadel. Wind howled through the crenellations like a banshee, and rain lashed against the tall, arched windows. Mira had been woken by the storm, and she sat by the fire, wrapped in a heavy blanket, watching the flames. Lucien stood by the window, a silhouette against the violent, flashing sky. The storm, like her, was a force of chaos and change in his world of stasis. "You are not afraid of it?" he asked, his voice a low rumble beneath the roar of the wind. "It's only weather," she replied, her voice calm. "It will pass. The dawn will still come." The word dawn hung in the air between them. For her, it was a promise. For him, a threat. The Great Eraser. He turned from the window, his face etched with a sorrow so profound it seemed to carve new lines into his ageless features. "I have not seen a sunrise in 547 years, he said quietly. "I remember the colors, the slow burn of orange and red, the final, brilliant flare of gold before the blue takes over. I remember the warmth on my skin." He paused, his gaze distant, lost in a memory a millennium old. "It is the one thing I truly miss. The one thing for which I would trade all this." He gestured vaguely at the castle, the power, the immortality. In his voice, Mira heard the core of his tragedy. Not the hunger, not the sleeplessness, but the eternal exile from the light. She rose and went to him, stopping just before him, closing the distance that had separated them for so long. She looked up into his dark, haunted eyes. "Tell me about the last sunrise you ever saw," she said softly. And he did. He spoke of his mortal life as a prince in a sun-drenched land of sand and sea. He told her of the day he fell in battle, of the mysterious stranger who offered him a choice: oblivion or an eternal reign in the shadows. He spoke of his first agonizing transformation, the burning of the sun on his newly sensitive skin, the final, painful retreat into the night. He spoke for hours, the words pouring out of him, a torrent of memory and loss that he had kept locked away for centuries. He was not a king speaking to his queen. He was a man revealing his deepest, most painful wound to the one person he trusted not to turn away. He revealed his weakest self, risking her rejection for the chance to be truly seen. When he finished, the storm outside had quieted to a gentle rain, and the first, faint hint of gray was touching the eastern sky. The dead hours were ending. Dawn was approaching. Lucien instinctively moved to retreat into the deeper shadows of the room, away from the fatal promise of the windows. But Mira reached out and took his hand. The thermal contrast was as stark as ever. Her hand was a brand of living heat against the marble cold of his. But this time, it was not a shock. It was a connection, an anchor. He froze, his gaze locked on their joined hands. "You don't have to see the sunrise, Lucien," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion that mirrored his own. "But you don't have to face the dawn alone anymore." He looked from their hands to her face, and in her eyes he saw not pity, but love. A love that was as fierce and resilient as she was. It was not the explosive, fleeting passion of his mortal life, but something deeper, stronger, forged in darkness and tempered by truth. He had spent centuries starved for connection, and here it was, a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. He brought her hand to his lips, a gesture of profound reverence. His lips were cold against her skin, but the intent was the warmest thing she had ever felt. He did not kiss her hand. He simply held it there, breathing in the phantom signature of her life, committing the feeling of her skin against his to an eternal memory. Mira, he breathed, her name a prayer in the ancient tongue. She smiled, a true, radiant smile that lit up the dawn-lit room. I am here, she replied in the same language. It was not a fairy tale ending. He was still a creature of the night, and she was a daughter of the day. The sun would still rise, and he would still have to retreat into the shadows. But it was a new beginning, a new normal. They would face the eternal night and the fleeting day together. Later, she would offer the crimson gift, and he would accept. Not as a predator taking sustenance, but as a husband sharing an act of ultimate intimacy with his wife. It would be an exchange of life, a slowing of two heartbeats, one beating, one silent, into a single shared rhythm. He had groveled, he had atoned, he had earned her. And in doing so, he had not just saved his throne. He had saved himself. Standing there, holding her hand as the deadly light crept over the horizon, King Lucian felt the first flicker of peace he had known in 500 years. His kingdom of stillness finally had a heart. And it was beating.